Captivating conversations and insightful information to encourage and inspire you with all you need to become the best you can possibly be. And now, your host for Real World, Real Talk, Dr. DZ Cofield.
Welcome to Real World, Real Talk. I'm your host, Dr. DZ Cofield, and you're listening to your member-supported public radio station, your number one source for jazz and more, KTSU 90.9 on the FM dial and KTSUradio.com. Tonight's discussion promises to be a powerful discussion, I think a mind-changing discussion, as we talk about voter suppression, and we're going to talk to an expert about why it is important to fight voter suppression, why every U.S. citizen should have the right to vote, but not just the right to vote, to have easy access to voting. Why would we want to make it more difficult for you as citizens to vote? We hear a lot of things being said from the right and from the left, but at the end of the day, we need to make up our minds as to why this battle is going on. Why are 43 states proposing legislation to make it more difficult to vote? And we're not just talking about voting. I mean, think about this. It's going to be a criminal act in some states to give somebody water and food if they're just in line to vote, or to provide a chair for them to sit down if they're standing in line for hours and they're waiting, or to lessen the hours available for people to go and vote. People were offended that in Harris County, for example, our interim county clerk said, hey, let's make voting easier for second and third shift workers. So they decided to have one day, just one day, for voting booths to be open at selected sites 24 hours. They were monitored, just like they are monitored from 9 to 5. They were monitored, but they were open for 24 hours. Do you know how many doctors and shift workers had an opportunity to vote and they would have had to take off from their jobs in order to vote? People who are the working poor, for example, who don't work salary work. So they literally, if they don't go to work, they don't get paid, right? These people were able to go and vote outside of their work hours. And we have people who want to take that option away from them. We're going to talk to an expert about that on today. Now, just a couple of housekeeping matters before we move forward. If you'd like to follow me during the week, you can follow me on IG, Instagram, at DZ Cofield. You can follow me on Facebook at DZ Cofield, and you can follow me on Twitter at DZ Cofield. I still haven't gotten quite comfortable with the Clubhouse scene yet, although I'm thinking I'm going to host a Clubhouse talk in the not too distant future. So keep your eyes and your ears open, and we'll let you know when that's coming up. Man, I'm excited to have with me today Sarah Walker. Sarah is the executive director of Secure Democracy. She's a veteran election integrity specialist. She oversees all Secure Democracy state and federal legislative work and partnership management. Prior to joining Secure Democracy, Sarah served in state government and held various roles in government relations. I'm excited to have her with us today. She is progressive and working hard. Secure Democracy is a nonpartisan group, so please don't say, oh, this is a Democrat or this is a Republican. No, this is a nonpartisan group that is just committed to giving people an opportunity to participate in the democratic process. She was the first African-American lobbyist in Minnesota, and as a full-time political consultant, Sarah worked with local nonprofits and political institutions to create a community equity pipeline to increase the number of people of color working in political institutions. I want you to join me today in welcoming to Real World, Real Talk, Sarah Walker. Sarah, how are you doing?
I'm good. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you, Pastor. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you about this really important issue.
Man, I am so excited to have you because we've been talking about voter suppression over the last several weeks. And many of the conversations that we have had have been anecdotal. And there have been some people who have just called in and said, look, why are we talking about this? Because they really don't see the relationship between voter suppression and food on their table, or voter suppression and their paycheck. So I'm going to give you permission to talk to all of us like we're 5-year-olds. I mean, help us understand, first, what is secure democracy about? And secondly, why it's so important that secure democracy exists.
Sure. So first of all, secure democracy, we actually only formed about 4 years ago because what we saw was an immense need for people to work inside state legislatures to advance policies that both ensure election integrity, but also increase access. One of the most important things, and please when you hear these conversations about election integrity, don't be fooled. Election integrity can also mean more access. And people are trying to send a message right now that is false, that election integrity somehow has to require limiting access. And that is a false narrative that needs to be stopped right now. So we support transparency and modernization of our elections in a way that will increase access. Because today, voting access is at risk for over 190 million Americans, and that's including 17 million Texans. And we have a proud tradition in our country of state and local control over elections that should be strengthened. But right now, unfortunately, what we're seeing are unrelenting efforts to limit Americans' freedom to vote across the country. And particularly, if you look at what happened in Georgia and the recent controversy around the bills that introduced and then passed, I don't think anyone can believe that that is a coincidence. There are two things driving that are very clear. One, we all saw what happened in the Capitol after almost a year of lies about claims that people stole the election. They weren't just saying that someone stole the election, certain people. They were talking about certain people, and they were talking about Georgia, because if you look what happened is the African-American community showed up in Georgia and won 2 Senate seats, changing the power dynamic in Georgia. And that is going to have real life impact. So if you don't think it matters, it means that for the first time in too long, issues that are important to at least my family and many others, things like police reform, gun violence prevention, the Violence Against Women Act, these things have a real chance for getting through Congress for the first time. But also, if you just look at COVID vaccine distribution, you see under this new administration, the opportunity and the focus to actually make sure that all of these things are done with a focus on equity and making sure all communities have access. If you look at the recent COVID package that passed, that's about getting money in the hands and putting food on the table for people. And that money, that's what that money is intended. And this is why voting and elections matter. There are real life consequences when you vote your values.
So let's talk about Georgia for a moment. I think everybody watched with great anticipation to see what would happen in Georgia, not just with the results of the presidential election, which basically sealed President Trump's inability to win a second term, but also later on coming out of Georgia, the total shift in terms of the U.S. Senate seats, and U.S. Senator Ossoff and U.S. Senator Warnock, to see that shift that took place in Georgia. I don't know if anybody anticipated, and I'm going to call it this, the white lash that would come out of those election results, and to have 43 states, including Georgia, and you have a governor and an election official who were pressured by President Trump to come up with 11,000 votes so he could win the state of Georgia, and to have them now, and they were very clear in saying, the votes are not there, Mr. President. We can't find what's not there. And then to see 43 states, including Georgia, respond the way they did, I don't know if anybody anticipated that. The secure democracy, did you kind of see the handwriting on the wall?
Well, unfortunately, it is part of our job. So, I think part of the reason I do this work is, we spend a lot of time in the pre-election period, one, making sure that because of COVID that everyone had access to the ballot. So that was, making sure if states didn't have absentee balloting that they had it. But I was tracking very closely the comments of our former president and also reading newspaper articles, and I read both sides of the aisle. And I was unfortunately not at all surprised at the attacks that were coming. One, because some of the attacks on ballot access aren't new. But number two, because I knew that there would be a sense that there had to be a price paid for this election. And in fact, no one should be surprised, especially post January 6th, because that really was the culmination of it. I mean, that was the culmination of the sort of perpetuated lies. But I think honestly, there are some really troubling things in addition to what's happening in 43 states, which we will hopefully fight off with your help. I think that there are trends that get talked about even less in those 43 states. And one of them is an attempt to take away power from nonpartisan elections administrators. And so it's like it's a blatant power grab. And I say this, for example, one of the parts of the bill that passed in Georgia, it actually allows state legislatures to intervene in local elections matters. Well, my understanding is that local elections administrators actually know their communities better. They follow the law in Georgia and across the country. And we should not insert in traditionally nonpartisan areas partisanship. And one thing I'll say in Texas, one of the pieces of the Texas bill that is most concerning to me is that they want to allow partisan poll watchers. And they want to let poll watchers have basically unfettered access to the polls. So if you can imagine, you can end up in a situation, whether you're a Democrat or Republican, where you're going to have partisan poll watchers trying to identify or making assumptions based on race or other factors, gender, about where you're voting and who's going to challenge your vote. Why would we, in this period of hyperpartisanship, interject more partisanship into this elections process? That fundamentally undermines one of the most trusted systems that we had in our democracy. And we just can't let that happen.
Yeah. I know in Harris County, for example, Harris County has been red for as long as anybody can remember, even though the city of Houston has been a blue enclave within the county. And the county was very proud of the fact that you could go in and vote straight ticket, and Republicans benefited from it. I know African Americans, for example, who shifted out of the Democratic Party and went to the Republican Party because they knew that the overwhelming majority of residents in Harris County voted straight ticket, and they would hit that button and vote straight ticket Republican, regardless of who was running on the Democratic side. That backfired as many judges, including 17 new African-American female judges, came into office on the Beto wave. And right after that, it was voted, no more straight ticket voting. You can't vote straight ticket anymore. And it's like, okay, that's not going to stop people who want to vote Democrat. They just have to press a bunch more vote buttons, but it was just amazing to see that reaction to what had been in place to now say, okay, that can no longer be in place. How is this going to hurt Republicans? Because it appears, and these 43 state legislatures, again, we're having a nonpartisan conversation, but they are all Republican led.
Yeah.
How is this going to hurt Republican voters, for example, who are the elderly or who are voting absentee ballots and the like? Or do they even care about that? Or is that just part of the collateral damage in what they perceive to be this necessary fight?
Well, I will just say this. First of all, I think I'm just going to address your first comment about the straight ticket voting. One of the trends that we have seen is that when someone loses, they change the rules. I told Pastor Cofield that I grew up in Houston playing sports, and I learned when I lost a game, you go back and you look inside yourself and you evaluate how you lost. You don't change the rules of the game. But on that note, I think that what I think is actually Republicans may be hurting themselves. These bills that are being pushed in many of these states, but in states, particularly in Texas, are actually going to target some of their own voters. I think that they got ahead of themselves in introducing many of these bills without thinking about the consequences or looking or analyzing the data. For example, fewer than 1 in 5 Republicans voted in Texas, or voters in Texas voted in person on election day, but yet these bills are targeted at people who voted early and absentee. So that means really they're targeting 4 out of 5 of their voters. So restricting access to absentee balloting and early voting could really disenfranchise Republicans' own voters. And also, Texas voters across the political spectrum took advantage of what few options were available to them. Only about 1 in 8 voters voted in person on election day. That's 62% of all votes were cast by early in-person voting, and 1/4 were cast by mail. So again, if this was popularly used throughout Texas, why are you pretending like this somehow was some sort of political maneuver by Democrats when it in fact was not? I would also go on to say diverse groups of voters exercise their freedom to vote early and in mail. 91% of voters aged 55 or older voted by mail or early voting again. 88% of Black voters, 87% of Republican voters, and 92% of veterans and active duty military voters chose to vote early. And so the reason behind these bills is really confusing. In addition, we did a poll. 86% of Texans believed the 2020 elections in Texas went well, and 97% reported having a good experience. So why this is a priority for legislative leadership in Texas is beyond me. And it's why we have to raise our voices. If you work somewhere, you need to tell your company it is important that we take a stand now. You should need to engage your church members, and you also need to engage your legislative leaders and tell them that this is not acceptable.
Let's talk a little bit about this engagement and what would be the challenge to just the average Joe or the average Jane who is out there, who is listening to this show, who will be watching this broadcast, watching this podcast, and they're saying, okay, how can I get involved and how can I let people know who are in these states, who are in these legislatures, that this is nonsense, that this is foolishness, to sit there. And one of the things that I have been reporting, since it started was, all of these accusations of a fraudulent election were bogus because these people, when they file lawsuits, they never use the word fraud in their lawsuits. They know that there's a legal burden upon them to prove when you use these words. You can use words in the media that you can't use in court, right? If you use these words in court, now all of a sudden you got to back it and you've got to show it and you've got to prove it. And these cases were thrown out from California to New York, from Florida to Oregon. I mean, just all across the country, these court proceedings got no traction when this accusation was being made about fraud. What can the average person do besides being frustrated and upset about it? What's the call to action to people that Secure Democracy is making?
Yeah, so my call to action is, first and foremost, contact your state legislator and tell them that this is the most important issue to stop. We need to stop these bills in the tracks. Number 2, I would recommend, we work closely with a group called Black Voters Matter. I would go find them on Twitter. I would go visit their webpage, sign up. They are sending out daily actions that you can do within your community, and we'll send you links to your legislative leaders. And I say that because if you can see right now, we are in a moment where corporations are stepping up and making statements and encouraging the Texas legislature to not go down this road that restricts ballot access. And so I encourage you again, I would visit Black Voters Matter Twitter, and I would visit Black Voters Matter website and sign up so you can get their actions. We as a community and a Black community have fought so hard for this right. It is a sacred right. For us, voting is a celebration. I know that the first time I voted was in Harris County, or my experience with voting, and it was actually going with my mother to watch her vote early. And that is a sacred tradition. And political participation is something that's passed on. It's something that's a learned behavior. And so we cannot let them interfere with our abilities to vote in the most populous counties, because when they do that, that is interfering with that tradition and that opportunity to pass that on to our child and our families.
If you're just tuning in, you're listening to Real World, Real Talk. I'm your host, Dr. DZ Cofield, and we have with us live Sarah Walker. She is the Executive Director of Secure Democracy, and we are excited to hear what's going on, not just in our community and in our state, but in our country in terms of this fight to bring about voter suppression. Sarah, talk about the corporate call to action, because you have a lot of people, and I guess maybe the first major shot that was fired after Georgia passed its legislation was to move the Major League Baseball All-Star game out of Atlanta. And, one of the tragedies in that movement, of course, was there was a big plan to honor Hank Aaron, who was a longtime member of the Braves, both in Milwaukee and in Atlanta. Some still view him as the home run king. And this was a man who, played in the Negro Leagues, who epitomized the dignity of what it meant to really play the game the right way. That celebration is still going to take place. It just won't take place in his hometown of Atlanta. And then one of the first organizations to respond outside of Major League Baseball was Delta Airlines. They were highly critical of this. And then we've seen politicians, including Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, who basically said, kind of like the criticism of basketball players who voiced their opposition to social injustice, and they were told by some to just bounce a ball and keep playing, that, now, hey, you corporations need to stay out of this. Just keep flying, or in Coca-Cola's instance, just keep producing soft drinks that we love to drink, but you need to keep quiet. Why is that corporate call to action so important?
Well, first of all, I just want to address the Hank Aaron. He was one of my childhood heroes. And I want to say this, is that, yes, it is a tragedy that he won't be celebrated in his hometown. But the tragedy and the blame for that tragedy should go on the legislators who passed those laws. Number two, we remember Hank Aaron because of the barriers he broke. And I believe he would support moving this because he was a barrier breaker. And as an African-American and for the African-American community, this was about standing up again for that most sacred right. So I don't have any regrets about it being moved. And I guarantee the community will find a way to celebrate him and hold them in their hearts and prayers through this. But second, in terms of business leaders, yes, I am hearing the criticism from some prominent Republican leaders. I think that there are a few things I would just like to make very clear. This is not new. From the bus boycotts in the 1960s until today, corporations have been the target and the motivator often for significant social change. Number two, this is not new. Corporations have been making statements and standing up for what their perceived interests are or perceived values of their employees and their communities. And this is not the first time, and it's certainly not going to be the last time. In the recent years, corporations have been on the forefront of education reform, of things around the freedom to marry. They stood up in Texas for the bathroom bill. So this is not a new issue. And so it is strange to me and a little bit ironic that people are making this and acting like this is the first time corporate leaders have stood up. The other thing we know is that corporate leaders are standing up because people are losing faith in government. And so they are turning, for better or worse, to our corporate leaders. And you want to know what? Corporations have things, especially large corporations, they have social responsibility offices. they have social responsibility offices because they know doing the right thing is good for business. Doing the right thing and having a place that is built on values and those values are lived also attracts talent. And so it's one of the reasons why they have social accountability departments or responsibility. And I don't think this trend is going to end anytime soon. And I also would say that business leaders right now have the opportunity to lead by publicly voicing their concerns. They are often the ones funding campaigns from behind the scenes of legislators on both sides of the aisle, but they are also the ones who have huge lobbying and political clout behind the scenes inside state capitals. So yes, they can make public statements, but they should also lend their inside the Capitol lobbying structures to help us defeat these bills and remove the damaging provisions.
Yeah, I think it was interesting that immediately following the public position that Delta Airlines took in not supporting the legislation, that the state legislature actually voted to repeal a tax break on jet fuel. So they literally came back off the top rope and was like, okay, so you're going to make a statement publicly, so it's going to cost you money. And I don't know where that fight stops, but I just thought it was interesting. And all we're talking about is giving U.S. citizens the right to vote. We're not talking about illegals and those, just preposterous ideologies that are being purported that, you have all these dead people voting and you have all these illegal people voting. We're just talking about U.S. citizens and making it easier for them to vote and not more difficult to vote, and making sure everybody has an opportunity to vote. What is Secure Democracy working on now around these 42 movements around the country in various state legislatures?
Yes. So what we do is we go inside the capitals and we have a team of consultants and we have our staff and we work to stop and where we can mitigate damage being done in these bills. But it also doesn't stop us from pressing forward on what we can do in a positive way. One, because I still think that there are opportunities that we can improve some of these systems, but we also spend a lot of time. And so, for example, in Texas, I just want to point out a few things that we really are concerned about. In the big Senate bill that's running, one, what they're doing is actually specifically targeting Harris County and some of the big counties and cities. They want to reduce the number of hours and local elections officials can provide early voting during the critical last week of the early voting period. And research from 2020 shows that voters of color voted at higher rates during extended hours than at any other, because often they're working two jobs. And what this bill does is, under the guise of uniformity, it actually increases early voting options for many rural and ex-urban jurisdictions. But what it does is it reduces the opportunity for big metropolitan areas like Houston, Harris County to actually have the flexibility to increase hours if they want. And that's because they didn't like what happened in the election when there was like 24-hour voting. And so again, this is really specifically targeted at certain groups. The other thing it does is it again creates a lot of partisan activists. It allows the partisan activists to serve as poll watchers, to intimidate voters, and it even allows you to record them. So how would you feel if you were coming to vote and you were having someone record you? I mean, this is begging for more chaos like we saw in the January 6th insurrection at the Capitol. And then I want to go to the House bill and talk about some of the things that, as a longtime criminal justice reformer, I am extraordinarily concerned about, is they turn making simple mistakes potentially into felony convictions. This is crazy. It allows people to be prosecuted for providing assistance to voters. So it requires if you're going to even help. So for example, if you have an elderly grandparent or parent, or you have someone in your family who has special needs and needs assistance at the voting booth, if you don't sign the right documentation, you can be charged with a felony conviction. It is out of control in a state, especially, which has long had one of the worst criminal justice records and prison populations, who has been working hard to make efforts to decriminalize its state, to now go the other way and go the other way just to be able to vote. And we know that when people add these sort of felony convictions, that is really a form of voter intimidation. They also create a lot of new crimes and felonies for people who are working as elections officials. If I was going to be we have a max exodus of elections officials because they don't want to work in the kind of hyper and partisan environment and be subject to all of these lawsuits and scrutiny, and now potentially also criminally liable. This is the wrong direction for the country to head, but it's also the wrong direction to Texas. And it undermines Texas's work over the last 10 years to decriminalize things. And so these are some of the really important things we need to be opposing. But there are some things. Texas has had one of the most restrictive voting policies in the country for the last 50 years. And so there are things that Texas really can do that are also on the table and being discussed. One of them is they could extend early voting. Governor Abbott actually during COVID allowed for an extra week of early voting. It was so successful. I just talked about how many Republicans used it, how many Democrats, how many veterans used it. We need to continue that tradition, or that what was enacted in COVID, and we need to continue that, add extra early voting. We also need to update online voter registration. Texas is only one of 7 states that doesn't have an online voter registration system. And Texas is increasingly over the last 10, 20 years with Austin has become like the tech center of the world, but yet we can't have an online voter registration system. And then the other thing is it's one of only 9 states that doesn't allow student IDs to be used. And we need to, for ID for voting, Texas needs to allow valid student IDs to be used when voting. The vast majority of other states are doing this. Anything else is just creating an unnecessary barrier and is suppressing the votes of students.
So for someone who is listening and they're hearing this argument against voter suppression, they ask the question, why is this so important? So I want you to take a moment, if you will, to really dig deep and dig down on the effect that this voter suppression has on our everyday living. People who are listening, who say, well, it's not really voter suppression because I have an ID and, I can take time off. I can go vote. So it's not going to stop me from voting. What are the far-reaching ramifications for voter suppression? Because I don't know if people fully understand that opening this door is going to open the door to a lot of things that we are probably not going to like in this country when you talk about our democratic rights.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, so first of all, I think that there are so many ways this plays into everyday life. And I just want to contextualize this because I think if you look internationally, we actually have some of the more restrictive voting policies of any Western country in the world. There are countries that have something that is actually called compulsory voting. And it means that every citizen is expected to vote. And if you don't vote, they actually ticket you. This includes countries like Belgium, Australia. And so we are not on the cutting edge, and we have always thought of ourselves or we like to pat ourselves back as leaders in democracy, but we are falling behind, and the implications are significant because what we know is who votes or who is listened to. And this is why what happened in Georgia is really remarkable. And you again see this direct link to what happens inside the halls of power is Black voters showed up and they won. And so when you combine voters showing up and translate that into direct political power, you see results in things that matter to you. And I just think it's far too important for us to just let it go. The other thing I will say is, I actually say that there are 2 kinds of voter suppression. There's the ones that people try to institute in the laws that are created at our legislatures across the country, which are incrementally trying to make things more difficult and create more barriers, because what we know is that any barrier to voting, 1, isn't needed, and 2, is actually it's actually an intentional and preventative block to someone's eventual participation. But the other thing is that we also need to continue to participate and have access to the ballot, because when we do, it encourages the Democratic Party and the Republican Party to actually court our votes. In both cases, if they are not courting our votes, it means they are not listening to us, and they court the votes of those people who actually show up at the polls. And this is so important. So we need to expect the parties to actually invest in our communities in order to get them to do the outreach and to do the voter registration, because for too long, communities of color have been sidelined and not prioritized in terms of registration. So I'd say, one, there's the laws that are created that then create these barriers that we cannot allow. And then two, we have to demand that the Democrat and the Republican Party actually do the job of courting our vote and listening to the policy issues that concern us, whether that's criminal justice reform or the need for education reform so that our schools are not failing Black children any longer.
What do you see, Sarah, as the fight to combat voter suppression, specifically in Georgia? I know Stacey Abrams has been attacked personally. This is not the first time that she's been attacked, but there are many who have seen her as kind of the symbol for voter mobilization that resulted in the shift and change that we saw in Georgia. What do you see as the lawsuits that are being filed, and how do you see that playing out?
Oh, I think that the lawsuits being filed, I mean, one of the things, and you pointed this out, Pastor, is that Republicans filed a lot of lawsuits. They were all thrown out. I expect that the Georgia laws, one, will be challenged, and I think that some of those challenges will be upheld, and they'll have to go back to the drawing board again. I think the other thing that I just want to relate to this is, yes, and Stacey Abrams did an amazing job, and I think anyone in the Black community can relate to this. Once you start accumulating any power, especially as a Black person or person of color, the knives will come out for you. And so I would say this: if you're not getting attacked, you're probably not doing very much. But it is essentially a threat to it's a threat to what was the normal order of Georgia. People are scared that for the first time in 20 years that Georgia might go Democrat. And not just at the Senate level, but also for the gubernatorial level. And I have, one of the things I talked to my husband about is, he calls it, the next Reconstruction, which is probably overdue. There is something seismic going on in our country. And I will just say, I don't know that anyone totally understands what is going on. But one of the things going on is that people are saying that we are no longer sitting back. And whether you are Democrat or Republican, we expect when we show up that we get something in return. And quite frankly, this is what every other community has done in politics, whether, and interest group. And I think that you're seeing that. And I think it's threatening not just the Republican status quo, but it's also threatening the Democratic status quo.
Mm. And just for those of you who are wondering, I was referring to the New Georgia Project, which was founded by activist and 2018 gubernatorial candidate Stacey Abrams, along with Black Voters Matter Fund and Rise Incorporated, filed a lawsuit against state election officials in Georgia, even in the U.S. District Court in Atlanta. And they are waiting to find out the results of this lawsuit that is claiming that Senate Bill 202 is a voter suppression bill. And so one of the things that I think is interesting in the midst of all of this, Sarah, is this commitment to fight. People in Houston and in Harris County, I think, really don't fully appreciate this in that, when you look at the strange demise of Jim Crow in the Houston metropolitan area, it was largely negotiated. People saw that it was bad for business. And so, hey, let's see how we can move forward so we don't have an interruption of business as it was interrupted in cities like Birmingham and Atlanta and in other major metropolitan areas. And so A lot of the rioting and pillaging and damage and things that was caused in other cities, Houston avoided that. How do you see us needing to respond here? Texas is your home. South Texas is where you're from. How do you see us needing to respond to what's happening on the state level, as well as in some ways on the county level? Although, you know, we have seen a season here with the election of Judge Lena Hidalgo that Democrats have the majority on the Harris County Commissioners Board. But what do you see is the responsibility of residents of Houston and Harris County? And again, let me be clear to our listening audience. We're not talking about fighting for Democrats to be in charge. We're talking about fighting so that everyone's voice is heard and everyone has an opportunity to freely vote so that the will of the people can take place.
Yeah, well, I think it is an obligation of every citizen of the United States to defend and ensure that we all maintain the freedom to vote. But I'll say particularly in Harris County, such a diverse county, I just say all this, understanding that we are literally living through the backdrop of the George Floyd trial. And perhaps Harris County was spared rioting, unlike where I am now in Minneapolis. But the reality is, if you don't want more George Floyds, then you need to go vote and you need to protect that right. Because a lot of the policies that ended up allowing for police violence to continue for years and decades, despite calls to action, despite rioting, was because there have been barriers and disincentives for African Americans to vote for a long time. Disincentives because we weren't listened to, disincentives because there were barriers put into place. And this is a historical trend. And it is time, and I think the country is standing up now and saying, this time is over. We are now going to we have to listen to these voices. So don't let anyone think for 1 second that you can take them, they can just create barriers to voting. The other thing I want to say, why it's even more important, is Georgia was ground zero for this new fight for voting rights across the country. But in reality, Texas is now ground zero. The bill was passed in Georgia. Texas needs to become the place where we send a message to the nation that this stops in Texas. Texas is not going to be the next domino to fall in barriers to voting. We are going to stand up and we're going to say, in Texas, we respect the freedom to vote.
Yeah, I think it's just amazing when you hear, for example, Governor Abbott comment that we did not see widespread election fraud in 2020, but we want to put more things in place to make sure we don't see widespread election fraud in the future. And you kind of going, why? Like, what's the purpose? What's the reason?
Well, and you know what's even weirder about that? Texas. There were no big Democratic wins. There was a lot of hope that that Texas would go Democrat for the first time and vote for President Biden. Didn't happen. Democrats didn't really pick up seats in the Texas legislature. There was no congressional level seats lost. So what are they suppressing? And in fact, whether you like it or not, whether you're a Democrat or Republican, in Texas, African-American men voted at a higher rate for Trump than any Republican president in the last 50 years. Latinos voted at a higher rate for Trump than we've ever seen from a Republican president. So I guess it's confusing to me. What is the intent of these? Like, what is the purpose of this?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. When you think about those numbers and who voted and how they voted, you know, you would think you're almost cutting off your nose to spite your face. I mean, because at the end of the day, Texas maintained what Texas had in place. And to your point, there was no major shifts. And I always ask the question, like, if people just didn't vote for President Trump, but you had Republican wins at every other level, how are you claiming the election was stolen and you got voted in? Because I'm thinking if we're going to change, you know, and we're going to try to steal an election, I want more than the president out. I mean, if I'm trying to steal an election, wouldn't I want senators out and House representatives? Wouldn't I want some shifts there? I mean, and local government, wouldn't I want some shifts there? Like, I don't, it's kind of just hard to believe that on the one hand, one person can claim that an election was stolen from them when the party overall benefited, picked up seats in the House of Representatives, lost its majority in the Senate. But we watched Georgia, and everybody had a microscope on Georgia. Everybody had a magnifying glass on Georgia, and you lost. So can you accept the loss?
And to your point, Pastor, the reality is in Georgia, yes, Trump lost. But do you know that the legislators in rural seats and exurban and suburban seats who were Republicans who won, they overperformed Trump by 8 percentage points in some place. So again, this is where I go to, if you lose at a game, you don't change the rules of the game. You look inside. This was a problem with their candidate and not a problem with the voting system. And so we would never allow this to happen in anywhere else in our lives. So why are we allowing them to try to change the rules of the game anyhow?
Yeah. You talked a little bit earlier, and I'd like to revisit this part of our conversation about the shifts and changes that would take place in public policy, education, addressing health disparities, if these voter suppression efforts are allowed to go forward without a challenge and to be victorious. Can you speak to that a little bit? Because I really want our audience to understand, for example, when in the state of Texas, we have over 2.5 million people who are uninsured or underinsured because we would not accept the provisions of the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, and the crazy part is we pay for it with our tax dollars. So we're already paying for it, but because of partisan politics, we say we don't want to accept it. And we have these large numbers of uninsured and underinsured people. Things like that, if I'm hearing you correctly, can happen across this country if these voter suppression efforts are successful.
Absolutely. And I'll just give a bunch of examples, but I'll start at the local level. I also always try to remind people that, we often think of the presidential elections, but it is your mayor and your city council that actually determines who your chief of police is, who gets to hold police accountable. But they also make decisions about, whose streets are actually getting cleaned or what potholes are getting fixed. And then I just think about things like school board elections. When I think our country is facing our next big crisis after criminal justice that just isn't getting quite as much attention is the immense failures of addressing educational equity. And I know for a fact that I care who is on my school board because I want to make sure that the African-American children in my community are getting the education that not only are your tax dollars paying for, but deserve. And then, then move up to the state level. You just pointed out healthcare and how that is managed. I think about who's getting tax breaks. Are you giving corporations tax breaks, or are they putting money back in hardworking families' pockets? Go to the federal level. There's questions about immigration right now. There are questions about whether or not they'll pass background checks on all gun purchases. Is going to the Senate. There are questions about whether or not they're going to restore the rights for formerly incarcerated individuals to be able to have their rights to vote back and not be perpetually punished. The list is endless, and why it is so important and how you can see that voting really impacts your day-to-day life it's just unbelievably critical. And it really pervades everything we do. But I also just related to that is it is a skill we need to teach our community, because every time we vote, we are educating our community and our children and our families, and we're passing on that proud, learned political tradition of political participation. And it's also, again, hard fought and hard won and sacred. And we need to continue to ensure that our communities show up and that our voices are heard and that our perspectives are not taken for granted.
Sarah Walker is the executive director of Secure Democracy, and we are happy to have her with us on today. Sarah, as we get ready to close out our show, time always flies. Give our listening audience some information, first of all, on how they can find you, contact you if they want to become a volunteer with Secure Democracy, if they want to give to Secure Democracy, if they just want to get in the fight with Secure Democracy. How can they get in contact with Secure Democracy?
Wonderful. I could always use some battle buddies, and you can find Secure Democracy at www.secure-democracy.org. I would also just encourage you to also visit Black Voters Matter. They are organizing corporate responsibility campaigns in Texas, and that is a great place to get engaged as well. So thank you so much, Pastor. I'm so happy that you've been engaged in this battle.
Man, we are excited to hear from you and excited to know that we can make a difference. Thank you so much for being with us. The late Vernon John said, if you see a good fight, get in it. I always add, if you don't see a good fight, start one. And the fight against voter suppression is more than just about yourself. One of the things that we have seen happening around COVID-19 and around our testing for COVID-19 and getting the vaccine for COVID-19, we've seen a very individualistic mentality around it as opposed to the community. I listened to a gentleman who lived in the U.S. and went home to Australia during COVID-19. And he said, you know, it's interesting. He said, we're not wearing masks and we're not physically distancing in Australia. And the reason is because when COVID-19 came, we shut the country down because we were concerned about community safety. He said, and there's a fundamental difference in what's happening in Australia and what was happening in the U.S. when I lived in the U.S. He said, because the U.S. is more committed to individual rights than community safety. And I thought about that statement. And, you know, he's absolutely right. Our country, while we are the United States of America, we value states' rights over federal mandates. And the truth of the matter is, we were a country born out of rebellion from under the British monarchy. And so we are more committed to individualistic rights. We are claiming that our rights are being violated because somebody said we had to wear a mask. Well, somebody's saying, what does that have to do with this conversation? I'll tell you what it has to do with it. It's not just my right to vote, right? I have an ID. I have a state licensed, certified form of identification. So my right to vote is not going to be infringed or impinged upon at this moment. But other people's right to vote under these voter suppression tactics are going to be made more difficult. It's going to be made harder. I can stand in line for 5 days or 5 hours or 5 minutes, right? I can stand in line and I'm not worrying about losing my job. But there are other people who can be fired because they made a decision to stand in line and vote. I'm not going to not get paid because I decided to vote and I stood in line for 2 or 3 hours. There are other people because they are hourly employees and their bosses have this right. They don't have to get paid when they take off to go and vote. So why wouldn't we make voting more accessible? Why wouldn't we give people a greater opportunity so they won't be penalized for voting? My hope and my prayer is that you will get actively involved in this voter suppression fight. And if you're not sure, or if you don't know, or if you're not clear on how voter suppression will affect you, then research it, read about it, so you become informed. This is Dr. DZ Cofield for Real World, Real Talk, signing off. You're listening to your member-supported public radio station, KTSU 90.9. We are your community station, The Choice, and on ktsuradio.com. And I want to thank all of you who are listening on the Real World, Real Talk podcast network. Until next time, God bless is my prayer.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Real World, Real Talk. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast to be notified of new episodes every week. Follow us via social media using the @RWRTDZ username on all platforms: YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. To submit any comments, questions, sponsor opportunities, or future show suggestions, visit us online at rwrtdz.com or via email at info@rwrtdz.com. Thank you for listening, and we hope you've been inspired to be the change you want to see in the world today. Until next time, be real, keep it real.